Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and I thought I would celebrate a recent occurrence in the chess world in a kind of, slightly immodest way. So a couple of days ago, though unfortunately it immediately passed, Alexander Morozovich, great Russian grandmaster, was leading the Tal Memorial in Moscow, and in fact, very, very briefly, for all of one round, had reached the top spot in the world ratings, at least the live top ratings. So he wasn't number one on the official list, but he had at least become the de facto number one. So it was by all of .9 rating points. So 9/10 of a rating point was the margin of his lead over Anand, and immediately the next round he lost to Ivanchuk, and that dropped him out of number one. And then he lost again yesterday. I'm trying to remember to whom. To Kamsky, I believe. And so now he's probably in third or fourth, for all I know at this point. I think he's probably behind Ivanchuk and Carlsen as well. Be that as it may, he did reach number one, and so I thought, well, I'll take the opportunity to point out that I'm actually, at least at that point, was actually 2-0, at least in blitz games, against the world's number one rated player. So neither of these games is especially great, but they have their interesting moments, and they're instructive moments as well. Of course, we can't have a video without at least some instructive value. So I'm going to present them, and hopefully you'll find them enjoyable and maybe learn something in the process, and will forgive me my immodesty. But, it's not every day that you can say that you've beaten the number one player in the world. And unfortunately, it may be only one day, in my case, that I can say that. Alright, so this game was a 2-minute game. Both these games were played on ICC. This was played in 1999, almost exactly 9 years ago. So it was, I think, August 24, 1999. And at this point, I think he was number 4, maybe number 5 in the world. So, it wasn't quite number 1, but still already a very, very strong player. So in Bullet, my rating has always been, let's say, well, it's not that it's necessarily been higher, but that other people's bullet ratings aren't as high as their blitz ratings when you get to the top numbers on ICC. So I think at this point our ratings were actually pretty close in bullet, so I was a reasonable challenge for him to accept. All right, so this is a 2-minute game on black, and let's have a look. Okay, so we've got an Italian game, and then Morozovich played the Evans Gambit, which in fact I think about a year or so afterward he trotted out at least once in serious play. So for those who think that this is some kind of evidence that it's not really him, no, in fact he actually gave this a try. Alright, so I took c3, and now I would say the absolute main line is perhaps bishop to a5, but the move I played is also quite common. So I played bishop to e7. And this is a more solid approach, and I felt that this would be a better try for Morozovich. Okay, now to be honest, I mean, it's not like I faced the Evans a whole heck of a lot. I used to play this as a kid, and I had decent results, but not against elite opposition, to be sure. But I've almost never faced it in my career, such as it is. I don't think I've ever faced it in a tournament game, or at least not that I recall. If it was, it wasn't against an especially strong player. And I've almost never seen it in blitz either. So, kind of strange. I mean, when you consider all the kind of offbeat openings that get played regularly. I mean, people play the Black Redeemer, they play the Latvian Gambit even, which I think is the worst opening in all of chess. But I almost never see the Evans Gambit, even though I play 3 bishop to c5 relatively regularly. I mean, it's not. I don't only play e5, and I don't only play 3 bishop to c5, but I mean I've certainly played it many times in my life, so it's kind of surprising that I've seen it so rarely. In any case, in this game I did see it, and I chose bishop to e7, which is a more solid approach. Okay, now here White has 2 fundamental tries. Morozovich played queen to b3, and this used to be, I think, the more interesting line, but thanks to Kasparov in 1995, ironically perhaps, in a Tal Memorial, he played d4 against Anand, and then he played it again, I believe, against either Timon or Piquet. I forget which player he also used it against. And in both games he won. in crushing style. Now, d4 isn't new. I mean, this is ancient. What's new is that after knight to a5, okay, the main line used to be knight takes e5, and the thought was, okay, knight takes c4, knight c4, and now the typical freeing advance for black d5 kind of fixes all the problems. And I would say, as a general rule, let me say a couple of things about e4, e5 openings that I think are useful here and of quite general value. So the first thing is that in many e4, e5 gambits, when white's making the gambit, that is, I would say in almost every case, black doesn't have to, but will be in pretty good shape if he first accepts the gambit and then returns the offered pawn at some convenient point. And then the second general point, and this often goes with the first point, is that if black can play the liberating move of d5 without anything really bad happening, then he's in great shape. And so it is here. So black is returning the extra pawn in order to play d5 in this position. And after ed, queen d5, knight e3, queen d8, we've reached a position which occurs many times. Black has the bishop pair and the let's say the statically superior pawn structure. So white has a little bit of extra space, obviously due mostly to the isolated pawn couple in the center, which could become hanging pawns. And the position is roughly equal. Both sides have their own respective trumps. I probably would prefer black here, frankly, but I think objectively it's about equal. I think when I checked in the databases too, this position has scored better for black. Let me take a quick look here. Yeah, so that seems to be the case here, that black has done quite well after the main move, which is castles. Alright, so that's the old-fashioned approach, and black had no problems here. But Kasparov's idea was to play bishop to e2, and then after e takes d4, not c takes d4, which would allow black to again play the typical liberating move d5, and to do so without even having to sacrifice anything back, but instead queen takes d4. And it turns out that no matter how black responds to this threat of queen takes g7, it involves some concession or other. If he brings the knight or the bishop to f6, well, e5 is going to cause some disharmony and gain some time for white. I think black's main move here now is king to f8, but obviously this too has its drawback. I mean, black isn't going to be able to castle, and this means not so much that his king is going to be in danger, but that it's going to take him quite a while to finish his development, and this rook on h8 in particular is going to be shut out for quite a long time. And then there are also lines where black just returns the pawn, but of course that itself is a concession. It means that white gets to reestablish material equality. So this d4 line, I would say, is white's most promising approach nowadays against bishop to e7 in the Evans Gambit. But Morozevich played queen to b3, and this is the other important approach. And it too has, on the surface at least, very obvious and clear advantages. So black's best move here is to play knight h6, and this at first seems unproblematic because it protects the pawn, it prepares castling, and black also would like to play knight to a5, eliminating this dangerous battery and the dangerous bishop as well. And in that case, it would seem that everything is going quite nicely for black. But after d4, knight a5, queen b5, knight c4, white throws in this Zwischenzug, or Zwischenzug, I should say, with bishop takes h6, and now, okay, after g takes h6, queen c4, white's position looks really excellent. Okay, e d c d, and here, although black is still up a pawn and has two bishops against two knights, white has more space and this beautiful center, and with black's doubled h-pawns, first of all, the extra pawn looks pretty meaningless, and secondly, it's far from obvious what black's king is going to do if it wishes to live a long and prosperous life. So how should black play here? Well, the solution is what I suggested earlier, the thematic solution, d5. So this wasn't a new move or anything. I'm not sure if I knew that it was theory, but I think I probably would have suspected it, or at least felt natural to me as a lifelong e5 player. So I return the pawn, but in so doing I achieve many positive gains for my position. So first of all, I'm ruining his center to some extent. He doesn't get to have this beautiful side-by-side pawn couple in the middle of the board, but is going to wind up with double isolated d-pawns. They're of course not going to control as many squares either, so the e-pawn is going to be evicted, and then I'll have, for example, f5 for my bishop as a possibility. So I'm ruining his pawn structure. I'm aiding my own development. I'm preparing to castle queenside, perhaps. So that's kind of goes along with the comment that I made about aiding my development. And okay, this just in general kind of equalizes the raggedness of both side structures. I mean, after he plays e takes d5. Now, okay, I've got 3 isolated pawns on the king side, but he's got 3 isolated pawns on the queen side. I still have my bishop pair, and it's also not clear any longer what exactly he's going to do with his own king. So with the center open, I can start to bother it. And if he castles kingside, I've got the g file. And castling queenside doesn't look overwhelmingly hospitable either. So I would say at this point that black should be quite happy with the results of the opening. Well, we're still in the opening, but overall black should, I think, be reasonably happy here. Okay, so after e takes d5, I played a move, which is, I think, another good move. Rook to g8. I could castle, I suppose, but still not all that exciting, and so it seems to me better to kind of quasi-castle with just playing king to f8, because my king's actually in pretty good shape there. It's off the e file, the f file is closed, there's not really any obvious diagonal approach, and the usual objection to a move like king to f8 would be that it shuts in the other rook, the rook on h8. But here, the rook is able to, it's got an open file on g8, and it can always come up and over too if it needs to, let's say via g6. So my king is reasonably safe and well covered, my rook is immediately into the game, and I've got the bishop pair, so I have reasons to face the future with confidence. Okay, Morozevich played knight to e5 with a rather cruel threat of d6, which not only hits the bishop, but of course threatens checkmate in one move. So naturally I'm going to stop this with bishop to d6. And it turns out that there's actually a game in this line, but it only occurred last year. So Morozevich and I are the advanced guard here. We're the avant-garde, and these guys are the copycats. So I'm kidding, of course. There's no reason to think they would have known about this game. Okay, in that game, white played, I think, the correct move here and played g3, just protects the pawn. Black plays bishop to h3, ensuring not only that white's not going to castle, but this bishop could also, well, there's a threat. The threat's to play bishop to g2, and after rook to g1 to play bishop takes d5, followed by bishop to b4 check, and then not queen takes d4, which is kind of impossible, but queen takes d5. So nifty little threat here. White played knight to c3 to stop it and to develop. And then here, black played king to f8, which is probably equal. Maybe f6 is even a little bit more spunky, kicking the knight out of there, maybe preparing king to f7, queen e7, and so on. Either way, black is in fine shape here, although in this particular game between Perot and Michalczak, played in Germany in 2007, white went on to win in 39 moves. So that's another 24 moves from here. So not because of this position. Alright, in our game, again, remember it's a 2-minute game, so we're going to need a little indulgence here as far as the quality goes. White played queen to e2. Oh, one other thing I should note is that castling is, of course, while it's, let's say, a natural move to make, it's bad for a fairly obvious tactical reason, namely bishop to h3 and black wins the exchange. Okay, so knight to queen to e2 is played, threatening knight to c6. But this is in fact a mistake, and take a quick moment and see if you can figure out why. Now, of course, I didn't have anyone telling me that it was a mistake, so I was not in as good a position as you are here. And I played king f8, which isn't a bad move in its own right. I mean, it's a very natural move, so I get out of the way of the discoveries. I'm clearing the e-file for maybe a rook to go there later. I could see something like queen g5, and this bishop comes out, and rook to e8. Something like that happening with quite nice play. But black did have something better, and that's bishop to b4 check. So the basic point is just queen takes d5, and although white will still have this discovered battery here with the queen on e2 and my king on e8 and the knight on e5 in between, the funny thing is that there's not really any good square for the knight to go to collect. Now, the one exception might be the c6 square, but as it turns out, there's not really any way to exploit it. So let's have a look. If king to f1, well, queen takes d5 and knight c6 check, bishop e6, knight takes b4 is just catastrophically bad because of queen g2. So I take the rook, castle, I'm up material, have an attack, overwhelming position, easy win. So king to f1 is not any good after bishop to b4 check. Okay, well, how about knight to d2? Well, the problem with this is that now I just take, and then there's nothing to win after knight to c6 check. So king takes, queen d5. Knight to g4, though, is tricky, but the point is, of course, bishop to e6, knight f6, goodbye queen. But I can just play king to f8, and then knight f6 does nothing because, well, knight f6, queen takes d4 is check, and I would just collect the knight. So I'm winning here. So bishop to b4 check would have given me a very nice advantage. Maybe black could play king, or white could play king to d1, but that's not really all that impressive either. Even if I have to play a move like king to f8, the problem is, what is white going to do on the next move? So that would have been the best play, but I chose king to f8 instead. Didn't really, obviously in a 2-minute game, was more concerned with just getting my king out of the way. Okay, now here white should have played probably queen f3, threatening mate, protecting the g2 pawn, but he played g3 here, and this is a mistake. Again, sadly, I missed bishop to b4 check, which is now just winning. Again, queen takes d5 is the follow-up. So again, apologies for the quality control here. So I instead played bishop takes e5, and this worked out quite well, even though it's a mistake. Now here, white should play queen takes e5. And I suspect he rejected this perhaps because of queen to e7, which isn't really the best move, though it's okay. I mean, black is still probably about equal here. And maybe Morozevich, you're playing the Evans Gambit, you're playing against someone who's not a world-class grandmaster, and you just want to wipe the guy off the board. I can understand that. And queen takes e5 won't do that. And especially won't do that after bishop to h3, let's say, and then queen to d7, when it's far from clear what exactly black or white is going to do about his king in the long term here. I mean, so I'm threatening rook to e8. This rook can come up to g6 if he tries to run over the queen side. My rook can go to g6 and then head out to this side of the board. And this is not a good position for white. Maybe with, let's say, computer-like accuracy, he can reach an okay position, but for humans, this is not good. So he wanted to avoid that, but unfortunately, d takes e5 is just a blunder. And here, I had no trouble capitalizing. It's all very, very simple. Queen takes d5, and the game is just over, believe it or not, because I'm not only threatening queen takes h1, but I'm also threatening queen d4, taking advantage of this trapped rook on a1. So Morozevich tried rook to tried castling, but after bishop to h3, he's out of luck. Threatening the rook, threatening queen to g2 mate, and the only way to stop the mate, realistically, is of course with f3, but then check, and I take the rook. So the game just went 2 more moves: queen c5, rook e1, rook a to d8, and now I'm threatening queen to d4 check, in addition to having the pleasure of an extra rook, and so my opponent resigned. So, not a brilliancy prize winning game by any means, and I think you'll find the second game much more interesting. But I think there are some valuable lessons from this that we can all think about and utilize. One is just to point out that if you play good, sound, solid moves, even against a world-class grandmaster, good things are going to happen to you. So I didn't violate any canons of the game. I played e4, e5 in the using techniques that have been known forever, where again you take the pawn, you give it back, you make sure you've got your fair share of the center, and hey, with a fundamentally sound position, even one of the world's absolute best players is not going to just blow you off the board. So I think this is a useful lesson game from that standpoint. So I didn't do anything spectacular. I just made reasonably good moves, and because they were correct moves, it enabled me to be in a position to win when my opponent kind of lost his mind. So there's one win down. Now let's take a look at a second game here. Okay, so this game, which I had white, was a 3-minute game, and it was unrated because in this case his rating was considerably higher than mine. It was about 500 points higher, actually 536 points higher to be exact at that time. And so, my attitude is that it's kind of inappropriate to offer a rated challenge to someone whose rating is so far above yours that you're not really going to be an especially interesting opponent to them on the merits, and there's certainly no external motivation for them. I mean, you can't gain any rating points because the difference is too great. So, it seems to me that it would just be rude to offer a rated match where not only is he doing me a favor by playing, but I'm also, not going to lose any points and can take his. So, I offered an unrated match, and there I think it's okay. Then if he's feeling charitable, he can play. It can be a little warm-up for him. He can be a little bit more relaxed about the game and not have to worry about it. All right, so under those conditions, we played. So I have white, played e4, he played c5, and now, slightly to my shame, I played the move b4. Now, why to my shame? Well, on my blog, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's chessmind.powerblogs.com. I've occasionally written, and from time to time do write, a little bit disparagingly, about joke openings or bad openings when they're played, let's say, consistently. So I haven't really addressed this topic in a while, but I addressed it fairly regularly at one point, and really kind of went out of my way to say that, you shouldn't play this way, at least as part of your serious repertoire, if you're trying to improve and trying to take the game seriously. So occasionally, this kind of thing is okay, and if you're playing it occasionally for blitz especially, that's fine, but it's not really the appropriate way, let's say, to conduct your real repertoire if you're trying to improve the game, you're trying to take it seriously, and so on. But anyway, at this point, I was kind of in a non-serious turn, wasn't really playing many tournaments at this point, and my repertoire just became worse and worse, just playing more and more garbage. And I've been curing this over the last year or so, a little bit more than that, but at this point, all kinds of junk was being used. Now, it's also kind of funny that both this game and the previous game featured openings with b4. So he plays the Evans Gambit in the other game, and that involves, of course, b4 and move 4. Here I'm playing it on move 2. Fortunately, I came out ahead in both cases, but not because of the merits of this opening. The Evans Gambit is, I think, much better than the Wynn Gambit. Okay, so c takes b4, a3. d4 is sometimes played too. d5, e5, knight c6, a3, and so on. I don't like this version as much, though, because it seems to me that it's maybe giving away a nice square like f5 for his bishop. So I'd rather keep his development a little bit more stultified if I can. Alright, so I played a3, and now here black has two main moves. There's what he played, which is just b takes a3. That's alright. But d5 is the main line. So white plays e takes d5, queen takes d5, and now almost everyone, I think, who plays the Wynn Gambit knows that you should play knights f3 here, and I think a lot of us are familiar with a kind of funny game played between international masters Kamran Shirazi, who had white, and Jack Peters, who had black. And this was from the U.S. Championship in somewhere in the mid-80s, 84, 85, or 86. And Shirazi actually played a takes b4, and after queen to e5, check, resigned. So the shortest game, certainly in U.S. Chess Championship history, at least shortest decisive game. Probably been draws faster than that. White just loses the rook for nothing. So at any rate, after knight to f3, white has some compensation. Whether it's enough or not, probably it's not full compensation, objectively speaking, but it's it's playable. Certainly in blitz it's playable. I wouldn't want to have someone prepare for me though in a serious game if they knew that I played this line. Okay, well, anyway, this is blitz. Morozevich played b takes a3, and here I played, I think, inaccurately. I played bishop takes a3. So probably the best move is knight takes a3, and it's even for fairly obvious reasons that I think it's best. Namely, this bishop on c1 is going to be best placed on b2, where of course it's on the longest diagonal, and the knight on a3 can sometimes go to c4, sometimes go to b5, depending on what black does. So, for example, let's say d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5. Again, we don't want to allow queen to e5 check, so knight f3, e5. And now both knight to c4, which threatens knight to b6. So notice we've got both a little fork at work here and a pin. So that's possible. And also the more straightforwardly aggressive knight to b5, threatening an even bigger fork, is available. So I think knight a3 is the better choice. So why did I play bishop takes a3 instead? Well, the thought is, okay, if he plays e6, bishop takes f8. So I'm avoiding that, whereas after knight to a3, black could play e6 and go for kind of a French structure. And I should point out, by the way, that wing gambits are also available against the French. So those of you who are intrigued by this, hopefully not too intrigued, can check it out here. Although I think the wing gambit against the French is better than the Sicilian version, but they're quite different. So here's c takes b4. By the way, there's in Moskalenko's new book on the French, he recommends not accepting it but playing d4, which is a very interesting approach too. Okay, so c takes b4, a3, knight c6, takes, c3. And then black has a choice here between bishop to f8, which frees e7 for the knight, and then only afterwards does he worry about bringing out the bishop. So let's say knight goes to e7, and then to f5 or g6, and only then bishop to e7. Alright, well, why not just play the bishop to e7 and bring the knight from h6 to f5? Well, the point is if you play bishop to e7, d4, knight h6, well, white can just take if he wants. So, anyway, that's why both bishop to e7 and bishop to f8 are options. Alright, so you can research that on your own. I just pointed out for your information and potential amusement. Okay, so back to the game. Bishop takes d6. Okay, so I continue to develop. He plays g6, and now naturally this encourages very strongly my bishop to return or to retreat to this long diagonal. It's got nothing to do on a3 now that he's played d6, and of course I don't want to allow bishop to g7, giving him the superior diagonal. Okay, so he plays knight to f6. And here I think is a good position to ask you what you would do if you were white to move here. So my e-pawn is not really under attack, but sort of under attack. And at any rate, black is just going to develop bishop g7, castles, and so on. So what should I do here? Well, there are three main moves, I suppose. One is knight to c3, defending the pawn and developing. I didn't really like this because it blocks my bishop's diagonal, so it seems slightly counterproductive. It's a fine move. There's nothing really wrong with knight to c3, but it just seemed a little odd with my bishop sitting there on b2. Though there is perhaps the idea of then following up with knight to d5. But let's say bishop g7, knight to d5, probably just e6. And I don't really want to just go trading. I mean, if material was even, that would be one thing, but a pawn down, I don't really believe that I have fantastic attacking chances here with so little material on the board. Not really any development advantage either. So knight c3 doesn't really light the fire. Okay, knight f3 is another choice, and I think this is okay. But after, let's say, rook to e1, well, my position is comfortable, and most of my pieces are out in decent locations. It really doesn't. I'm not sure what exactly it is that I have for the pawn. A little space, but no really clear plan. His pieces are all going to find their ways to good squares. So this didn't really appeal either. So I decided to create a little imbalance here and play bishop takes f6. Okay, so I'm giving up the bishop pair, but okay, now I at least have nice control over the d5 square, which is an important central square. So, okay, I get a little something, and I'm isolating his d-pawn. The f-pawns are doubled, though that's not going to last for long. Okay, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, f5, good move, takes and takes. And, okay, here I've got a choice. What do I do in this position? So I need to scrape up some play here somehow. I mean, I'm down a pawn. I have a little compensation, maybe in the form of control over the d5 square. The open files on the queen side are okay. They give me, well, not really Benko Gambit pressure here. I mean, it's certainly not as good as that, but at least potentially something vaguely along those lines. But all of these kind of compensations feel like the sort of thing that will just dribble away and disappear once Black finishes his development. So if Black can just make some natural sound moves like knight c6, queen d7, maybe rook e8, knight e5, it's hard to see what exactly I've got. And if I ever push the d pawn too, if this guy ever goes up, then I have to worry about rooks going to the c file and some kind of buffet here with my bishop and my knight, and maybe even the c2 pawn, depending on where my d4 pawn, my d pawn is gone. If it goes to d4, c2 is weak. So I have to figure out some way of making something interesting happen, or again, I'm just down a pawn and we'll get ground into the dust. Okay, well, one obvious move here is rook to b1, and this is probably maybe objectively the best move. I might have been concerned about bishop takes c3, but I don't know. I don't think this is really that great. I mean, sure, I've got weak c pawns now, but the open d file and the weakness of the dark squares, I think that's definitely to my advantage. So rook to b1, let's say queen d7, protecting it, developing, and so on. Knight to d5, and white has a little compensation here. Certainly compensation for a blitz game. Not probably for a correspondence game, I'm sure, and probably not even enough for maybe a game 30. But for blitz, it's something. Okay, well instead I chose to play knight to d5. And this, I think, is certainly suitable for a 3-minute game. Whether it's objectively right or not, let me challenge you to figure out. So, analyze bishop takes a1. That's certainly the most principled move. And try to figure out, can Black successfully play bishop takes a1? What's the proper assessment? And, prove it with variations as best as you can. Okay, well, I'll assume you stopped the recording and aren't going to solve it just in the brief pause that I offered there. And I would say that bishop takes a1 is, in fact, last chance to stop and figure it out, bishop takes a1 is the right move, objectively speaking. So after bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, white has a very big threat. Knight to f6 check is potentially catastrophic for Black. And this diagonal is certainly a lot of problem, is a big problem for Black. It's a lot to worry about. So what does he do? Well, if he tries f6, that closes the diagonal, but it opens up a new one. And both, let's say something like knight takes f6, which reopens the long diagonal too, or knight to b6 check, neither of these is at all appealing for Black, or should be appealing for Black. So the right move is, of course, knight to d7. And now white has, I think, at least 3 significant moves. The first is quite obvious, bishop to b5. So if the knight is covering f6, let's get rid of the knight. The problem is, Black can use the same philosophy and say, okay, if the knight on d5 is threatening to jump into f6 at some moment in the near future, let's get rid of it. So bishop to e4, bishop d7, bishop d5, and here Black is just up the exchange, end a pawn, and going to simplify further, completely won game. Alright, so that's no good. Another approach, well, okay, before we get to maybe the most challenging approach, we could also consider rook to b1. So this is not really advancing the knight f6 idea, but it's simply trying to bring another piece into the game, trying to, let's say, utilize everyone, invite everyone to the party, as Yasser Seirawan would say. And it does at least threaten to threaten. So the threat is now rook takes b7, and then rook takes d7. So black should act quickly, and rook to c8 is a good first step in that direction. So now, if rook takes b7, let's see, actually, I should have thought about this more carefully. Let's see, rook takes c4, rook takes d7, bishop d7, knight f6, king h8, knight d7, f6, takes, yeah. So even though White's kind of cleaned up the last few moves, he's still too far behind. So let's say if queen a7, rook c2, and if he doesn't take, White's up, or Black is up a full exchange with inadequate compensation. So rook takes b7 is kind of dangerous, but looks like it comes short. I mean, I don't see what else there could be after king to h8. Because if the knight moves anywhere, Black is going to play f6. So knight d7 wins a full rook, because you get the bishop for free, and you get the rook for the piece. But White was down so much material that it's too late. Okay, so rook takes b7 doesn't cut the mustard, as they say. And after d3, once again bishop e6, we've got to destroy the knight. And Black is just winning. So White's pieces are all very nice, they're all very active. He just doesn't have pieces of sufficient value to justify this as a sound attacking idea. So again, in blitz, maybe I can kind of fiddle around here, only down the exchange, but realistically, it's a lost cause. Okay, so that's 2 lines down after knight to d7. So we looked at bishop to b5, which fails to bishop to e4. And we looked at rook to b1, which should fail after rook to c8. Third try is rook to e1, though, and this has a big threat. Knight to e7 check, which wins the queen, because the king has no flight squares. And, furthermore, it also stops bishop to e4 ideas, too, so now that's no longer there. We can maybe threaten bishop to b5 and bishop d7 all over again. So this looks quite good. And notice, too, that if Black plays rook to e8, White regains the material by taking. And now, not knight to c7, because here the knight is in bad shape, and Black's also pawns up, and is going to take on c2, and so on. But instead, after rook takes, queen takes, White should play bishop to b5. And we know what that's all about. And here White does have fully adequate compensation for the material. So threatening knight to c7, threatening knight to f6 check, threatening bishop takes d7 and then knight to f6 check. White is okay. But Black does have a good move here, and it's really the only thing left if we're going to try to destroy the knight. Bishop to e6. Now, here it's a little tougher for White to make good things happen. One try is h4, with the idea of both h5, h6, but also maybe knight to g5 and taking and trying to make something good happen on the a2, g8 diagonal. Alright, so Black should play quite actively and accurately here. Rook to c8 is a good start, hitting the bishop. And now, just to give one line, let's say White tries h5. Here, it's Black has to be careful. If, for example, he tries, well, okay, let me just ask this: what should Black play here? So, if you hadn't come up with this position in your initial analysis of bishop takes a1, and you probably didn't, because h4, for example, is very much unforced. See what Black should do here. So again, take a moment, analyze this position. Should he take the pawn on h5? Looks kind of crazy. Should he take the bishop on c4? Why not? Should he play maybe f6, knight e5? What should he do? Okay, well, f6 probably doesn't make too much sense at first glance, because rook takes e6, but maybe rook c4. That seems a bit shaky to me. So let's look at the most obvious move. Rook takes c4. Why not? All right, White plays h6, kind of the whole point at this moment of the h4 h5 advance. And now, okay, if f6, rook takes e6, and white has reasonable counterplay. So there's pressure against f6. There's a threat to maybe take on d6. Maybe a leap like knight to g5 could prove dangerous for black. So white's in the building here. And if black plays knight to e5, well, this doesn't really help black at all. We take again. Once more, there's the threat of queen g7 mate. And after f6, queen e6, and again, white's in business. White's got genuine attacking prospects here. So rook takes c4 really isn't the best way to put a stop to white's attacking ambitions. G takes h5, as goofy as it might look, really is the best move. So we stop the h6 idea, and although the g file is open, it's not really that easy for white to maneuver his rook to that square, to a square on the g file. g4 is of course covered. e5 is covered by, well, e5 going to g5 is covered by black's d6 pawn and the knight on d7. If he goes to e3, well, he still has to move the knight out of the way. And okay, and black can maybe play h4 after the knight moves. So there's various ways that black can meet this, and it's, again, a fairly slow procedure. And also don't forget, also against the rook e3 idea, there's rook takes c4, and then rook to g4. So white is in a little bit of a tough spot here. So let's suppose knight to d4 is tried, and putting some pressure on the bishop on e6. And also with the tricky idea of maybe playing knight to f5 as well. So the point of knight to f5 is that we're threatening all kinds of things. So let me actually just enter this move here. So knight f5 is quite an attractive move, threatening, again offering free moves here, queen g7 mate, or knight to h6 mate. And if black takes on f5, then lo and behold, once again we have knight to e7 check. So this looks quite dangerous at first glance. Oops. But black has adequate defense to this. Alright. First let's look at rook takes c4, which looks at first glance natural, at second glance maybe not so good because of rook takes e6. But here, with knight to e5, black seems to be okay. So this closes off the diagonal. It also, in some cases, threatens to go back to g6. So anyway, the importance of closing the diagonal is that after f takes e6, knight e6, we're attacking the queen, and we're threatening queen to g7 mate. And kind of surprisingly, there's no way for black to move his queen safely to cover the g7 square. So knight e5 blocks that long diagonal. So rook h6, the only way to save the rook. Queen g5 hits the rook again. Knight f6 check, king g7, f4, so more tricks. And this does win the queen. Unfortunately for white, white's given up an awful lot of stuff for the queen. And the knight's going as well. And black is going to have two rooks and a knight, essentially, for the queen, and ought to win this position. So, very complicated line. And so we can say, as a practical matter, my exchange sacrifice is very, very dangerous. But again, objectively, it can be refuted. Another possible move for black here is just rook to e8 instead of the complications of rook takes c4. So at any rate, white has dangerous play. There are real threats, but it looks like at the end of the day that black can neutralize white's dangerous initiative after grabbing the rook. Okay, well, this is all very fine for a slower game, and taking time out to analyze and move pieces around. In a 3-minute game, Morozovic's decision to just play knight c6 and not bother with all of this is quite natural. Again, especially bearing in mind that he's playing a significantly weaker player. So he should be able to count on just being able to slowly outplay me, and doesn't need to go on these little adventures where the weaker player has a chance to just get lucky and land a knockout punch. All right, so knight c6. I play c3, closing the diagonal, preserving my rook, preparing to play d4. Okay, so he plays queen e7. I play d4, and he plays rook f to e8. Okay, so this kind of encourages me. Before this move, I don't really have anything. I mean, I just have a good solid position, but now rook ft8 gives me something to kind of nibble on a little bit. So what would you play here with white? And what do you kind of notice about rook ft8 as not a bad move, certainly, but a move that maybe gives white a little juice? You know, what are the possible disadvantages of rook ft8? Okay, well, the move I chose, I think, is the correct one, and it's queen to b3. And so what does rook ft8 do that's, let's say, wrong with the position? Well, first of all, now there's, of course, there are c7 forking possibilities. So that's always kind of there in the air as a tactical possibility. And, you know, all of this piece, I mean, there's possible forks all over the place. There's knight f6, only the bishop on g7 is covering that. There's knight to b6, covered by the a pawn. But you can see, I mean, all of these possible squares where forks could take place. So it doesn't mean that he shouldn't play a move like rook ft8. It just means that it creates these possibilities. It helps to create preconditions which are such that black can get into trouble, can have a tactical accident. All right. The second thing I think is maybe a little bit funny about the rook going to e8 is that after queen to b3, now I have, let's say, what I call quasi-threats against f7. So I'm not threatening anything. I mean, first of all, my knight on d5 is in the way. Secondly, even if the knight were to depart from d5, I'm not attacking f7 any more than he's defending it. So he's got two defenders, I'll have two attackers. But especially in situations where the opponent is short of time, quasi-threats are extremely useful, because often the opponent will see these and then in some way overreact. So maybe black should be concerned about this, maybe not, but there's always kind of a feeling that, oh, I've got to do something about this. And often you can kind of create an initiative where there really shouldn't be one, because there's just no threat. So my opponent immediately responded with b6. Now, the idea is a good one. He's protecting the b pawn, so he doesn't have to worry about queen takes b7 if his queen goes running off somewhere. And he's threatening knight to a5. I guess kind of an ironic echo once again to the previous game, where I played knight to a5 to swap off his light square bishop. So it wouldn't do any damage to me on the very same diagonal. In fact, yeah, again, the same setup, queen on b3, bishop c4, and so on. So I have to be alert to this. But by playing this, there are some new tactical possibilities. So let's say knight a5 happens. One thing I might be able to do is play rook takes a5, and then bishop to b5. All right, so this at least becomes a potential idea, kind of a counterfork. All right, but I decided, even more to the point, that I'm going to continue to build here with my quasi-threat, with knight to g5. Though it should be noted that maybe queen to a4, switching gears and, as I said, exploiting the weakness he created, might have been even better. So trying to take advantage of his overreaction, or potential overreaction. Okay, so anyway, I played knight to g5, kind of ramping it up here. And now Morozevich was cowed into not playing knight to a5, and he chose instead to move knight to d8. Okay, well, let's leave the realm of the quasi-threat behind and try to determine whether white really is in fact threatening anything. So take a look at the position and ask, can black, for example, play h6? And can black play knight to a5? Right, so both of these moves are putting me to the test. So take a few minutes on your own, stop the recording, and analyze and see what you come up with. Alright, well, let's first examine the move h6. So this tries to get rid of the only piece that is, in fact, attacking f7 at the moment. And let's see if white really does have something. Okay, so knight takes f7. If this doesn't work, then my whole strategy is a complete failure. So the knight goes back, and he plays knight a5, and there's just nothing for me. So knight f7, let's see if this works. Okay, so let's say king takes f7. Well, that just fails because the knight takes b6, and I pick up the queen. So we've got a discovered check. Don't really need the queen as part of that. Let's do it that way. I win the queen. Okay, if he plays queen takes f7, well, once again, I can exploit this this battery here and win the queen. So he takes the knight, I take the queen, I take the rook, and white is just winning, up a rook. So queen for 3 pieces balances out. One of the rooks balances with his, but then I've got a rook to spare. So after knight takes f7, he can't capture either way. But there's still one more move to consider here, king h7. And the point is that, hey, my knight could be stranded on f7. If it can't come back out, then I'm in trouble. So it looks as if I can survive, though, and be happy at the end of the day. So knight to e3, for instance, protecting my knight. And if he plays knight to a5, I take. I play bishop to b5. And here he can't play the otherwise attractive queen to b7 because of knight takes d6. So, say queen to e7, takes the bishop, takes the rook. And now my knight still seems to be in trouble, but I can rescue it. Queen to d5, hitting the d6 pawn, hitting the f5 pawn, and after, let's say, queen to e6, which prevents me from taking on d6 with the queen because then my knight hangs, but I can trade, play rook to a1, and surprisingly, there's no way for him to trap the knight. So I'm just going to bounce out like this or like this, and if he tries bishop to f6, then I play d5 because his rook can no longer go to f6 to keep the d6 pawn protected. Or if he played rook to e8, well, then I just take the pawn. So this is about equal here after rook to a1. He's got an extra pawn at the moment, and my knight is, or no, he doesn't even have an extra pawn. So it's really just that my knight is a little bit clumsy at the moment. And of course I have to take care of my back rank before I can go chasing his a-pawns. But yeah, white's fine. So what's the moral of all this? h6 is playable, but it's dangerous, and black has to play pretty accurately. White has to play accurately too, if black first finds all the right moves. Okay, how about knight to a5? Well, here too, this is okay, but dangerous. Alright, so rook a5, ba5, and now white has 2 reasonable ways to continue. So one is just to play knight to b6, and after a, b to play bishop takes f7 check. And this will terminate quickly into a draw. Because black can't play king f8 because of knight takes h7 check, and then rook to e1 check, and then queen b6, and black is going to be basically gutted here like a dead fish. I'm going to take everything. So he's got to go over to h8, but then I take the rook, and then it's perpetual check. Because if he tries to go running out with king f8, again, I go collecting here. And at the end of the day, I'm going to be up at least some pawns with an attack, or up a piece, depending on what black prefers. I guess black could play queen takes g7, and then rook e7. So maybe this is playable. So let me see here. Yeah, no, this could be okay. So queen g7, knight g7, rook e7, rook b1, king c7. Alright, so this too is about equal then. So even here, black is okay. Alright, so all roads lead to a reasonably near equal position. Maybe black has a tiny edge here because of the outside passer, potentially. So maybe this might be interesting. But I think, okay, let's say king f1, rook g7, king e2, the king goes to d3, play c4, so maybe black should play d5 here. Anyway, I think that white should be able to hold this without too much difficulty, but maybe black has a very small edge here. Alright, so after knight h6, king f8 is playable, though perhaps a bit dangerous. King h8 is safe, and that's just an immediate draw. Okay, so that was, going back here after knight a5, takes, that was knight to b6. I can also play knight takes f7 here, and this leads to more interesting play, though I think again an equal position. So bishop to e6 is best, knight to g5, rook a to b8, queen to a2, and now black has to be quite careful about the diagonal, so it's best for me to just get out of the way with king to h8. And so here I'll regain the exchange. Knight takes, and then knight to b6. I can even play queen takes a5 with adequate compensation, because here I have a pawn for the exchange in a very nice position. But I can also just play knight to b6, and this is equal as well. So opposite color bishops, even material, but no really great attacking chances for either side at this moment. So it should be about equal. All right. So after knight to g5, I think white has full compensation for the pawn here, to be sure, but black isn't in trouble yet. But these lines are all quite dangerous, and it's much easier for me to play with white than for black to defend. And so Morozevich here made a serious error with knight to d8. So he's right to be seriously concerned about f7, but he forgot about another tactical shot, and one that we've seen alluded to, I think, at least twice so far. Knight takes b6. So after this move, I'm just winning the exchange, and a full exchange at that, because I just got my pawn back by taking one on b6. And so the rest of the game is still entertaining, but happily one-sided. Okay, so a takes b6, rook a8, and now he plays h6. So here he's hoping, okay, he's going to drive me back, and then try to drive the knight back, and then hopefully push all of my guys back. However, I have a nice shot here. Rook takes d8. Why not? So he's got to take, and now knight f7, and because of the threat of knight to e5, discovered check, winning the queen, he doesn't have time to just move his rook away. So instead he plays, of course, d5. And here, at least initially, it looks a little bit tricky. Takes and takes, queen c4 and king h7. Sometimes two bishops can be a match for a rook and a knight, and my knight seems to be a little bit clumsy here as well. But I'm able to keep everything together, keep his pieces neutralized, save my knight, and win the game. But again, it does take a little bit of accuracy. So knight to c6, bishop e6, and already I have to be at least a little bit careful, because if I play queen to a4, then bishop to d5 is already a whoops. I'm losing my knight. So what I played here was knight to b8. And we have this funny little game here. So what I'm trying to avoid is allowing him to, let's say, get a setup like bishop to d5 and then queen to g4, where he can start to really put a little pressure on my king, induce some weaknesses, and give me a hard time. So I want to keep him from setting up that battery. If his bishop does get to d5, I at least want to make sure that his queen stays passive. Okay, so knight to b8 hits the queen, plays queen to f7. I play queen to c6. And at first it seems kind of paradoxical, unless you think I'm just chasing the b6 pawn. But it looks paradoxical because I'm inviting him to play bishop to d5 with tempo. And now, if let's say queen takes b6, I mean, I'm sure I can play this, but after maybe a move like queen to f4, maybe I have to be a little bit careful. So again, there's the threat of actually, let me make sure I'm got everything right here. Yeah, queen f4. So there's not only sort of eyeing this knight and keeping the white queen stuck a little bit, or threatening queen to g5 or queen g4, but really the big point is that black to move here has a very strong resource. Bishop takes g2 with an immediate perpetual. King g2, well, immediate perpetual if I take, and so on. All right, and let's say after queen f4, if white moves the rook to avoid this, let's say rook to e1, well then after queen to g4, white can no longer play f3 because, well, the rook isn't defending it anymore. So f3, bishop takes f3, and hey, white's got something to be concerned about here. So it might seem as if black is kind of getting out here a little bit, getting some hope. Well, maybe that would be the case if I played queen takes b6, but I played queen to d7. And so this is a very good move. It keeps him bottled up because not only am I threatening to trade queens, but I'm keeping an eye on this bishop on d5. So it prevents him from playing some active queen move like queen to f4 or queen to f6, hoping to make a mate threat on g2. And of course, if he plays queen to f5, I swap queens in about a millisecond. So he's got to play queen to g8, which is miserable. I mean, his queen is far away from the front of my king. So I play knight c6, threatening knight to e7. He plays bishop to e6. I play queen to d6. Again, keeping that strategy of keeping an eye on his bishop. And also I'm keeping my knight protected too, which is a good idea. Now he plays bishop c4. I play rook e1, queen to a8. And now, of course, I have no problems on the diagonal, no problems with g2. And now I just want to make sure that I don't fall for any tricks, so I play h3. So good, simple technical move. Avoid back rank problems before they ever even rear their ugly head. Okay, he plays bishop to f8, queen to d7 check. The point of bishop f8, of course, is to not allow rook to e7. So bishop f8, queen d7, check, king g8. If he goes to h8, then queen e8 forces a trade of queens, and then it's, well, it's already hopeless, but it's even more hopeless then. Less than no hope. So black plays king to g8 here. Now I play knight to e7. Very happy to trade. And it's not only trading, but further penetration as well. So he takes. The alternatives are even worse. So anyway, bishop takes, rook takes, and now, of course, this is a normal position to resign. I mean, he could have resigned earlier, but now for sure. But he decides to be kind of whimsical. Makes a few little joking spite moves, and then queen to e8 mate. So this was definitely a kind of a happy occasion for me, this April day in 2000 when I won this game. The other game was in August of 99. And as far as I know, these are the only two games I've played against him. So maybe I've played, maybe we've both been playing as a guest in Blitz, and I've lost countless times to him for all I know. But at least the two games where I'm reasonably, with a pretty high degree of certainty, sure that it's him. I was fortunate enough to come out on top. So, very nice. I mean, of course, let me just be as explicit as possible. I have no question at all in my mind that Morozevich is a much better player than I am. I mean, he's, of course, one of the great players of our time. And if we were to play, another 50 games, it's not impossible that I would lose them all. Not impossible that I wouldn't, but that it's even possible, reasonably possible that I could lose them all indicates just how big the disparity is. So, harbor no illusions. But again, there are certain things that certain morals that we can draw, and that I think should give hope to you whenever you're playing someone who's significantly higher rated. And ironically, the morals are in some way at cross purposes. So the moral of the first game was if you play good, sound, proper moves, following sound opening principles and good strategy, then your opponent isn't going to have any special success against you, at least while you're making these good, intelligent, well-founded moves. In this game, on the other hand, I didn't do that. So I played this kind of half-correct gambit and just grabbed the initiative and was fortunate enough that I was able to cash it in. So what's the real story here? Well, I think that the story here is one that I've certainly noticed frequently in my life, often as the player exploiting it, but sometimes as the player who's suffering as well. And it's that players. Let me back up a little bit and give a little background. I think part of what makes a strong player is that he or she knows lots of positions. The more positions seem familiar to you, all things being equal, the better player you are. Well, given that part of strength has to do with knowledge and familiarity, I think one of the best ways that you can give yourself a good chance against even a much stronger player is to draw that player into a position that's unfamiliar. Now, you can only take that so far. I mean, if it's unfamiliar, but your position is really, really bad, it doesn't really matter very much. But if it's a basically sound position and it's unfamiliar, well, then you do give yourself maybe a little bit more of a chance than you would otherwise have. So I don't really think that fully justifies, let's say, tricks. Maybe it justifies tricks or tricky openings in shorter games. In longer games, I think less so. I think when there's a big difference in quality, given time, the better player will almost always figure it out and punish you. And those will be situations where you'll have wished that you had played the correct kind of chess. All right. But when it's shorter, when it's a shorter time control, or if it's tricky but still pretty much fundamentally sound, then I think there's something to be said for these kinds of approaches where you look for situations that are more familiar to you, basically sound or reasonably sound, and that are likely to be unfamiliar to your opponent. So that's what happened here. I mean, I think he was a little bit hesitant. He made moves that were kind of natural, but not really the most incisive moves. And even before the blunder, where he hung the exchange, I mean, he had already really let me get the initiative. So I mean, I had progressed. So I mean, I went from just down a pawn for who knows what, to this kind of semi-sound exchange sacrifice, to really having full compensation and having a genuine initiative. So this way of playing, well, again, I don't want to advocate tricks, and I definitely think that the sort of tricky approach is the wrong way to go for slow chess. Playing sharp lines that are dangerous if you know them well, and that are at least fundamentally sound, where you're not going to end up, let's say, clearly worse, I think is reasonable, and especially so in blitz chess. So I hope you enjoyed the games. Hopefully you were a little inspired too. You can see that if even I can beat a player as great as Morozevich on a couple of occasions, then almost anything is possible. So go forth and do likewise. So share your great success stories as well in the comments, especially if they come in part as a result of this broadcast. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Sorry the length's a little bit long, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.